Let's deconstruct the Islamophobic ramblings of Shane Morris as he tries to justify his anti-Palestine bigotry.
What the Arab population in Israel wants to create is a second country, the nation of Palestine, that would be a radical, theocratic government that suppresses women. I do not want Hamas-led Sharia courts restricting women's ability to drive, vote, or often becoming victims of SA or domestic violence with no legal recourse.
This is a blatantly Islamophobic and colonial idea that Arab people do not have the right to self-determination and must be ruled over by Western occupiers if they do not have the same ideas about women's rights as those held in the West. And it is a dishonest argument to say we must deny the rights to self-determination for all under the guise of protecting the rights for some. The United States declared its independence from Britain in 1776, but did not grant voting rights for women until 1920 with the ratification of the 19th Amendment, 133 years after the Constitution was first ratified. American women did not gain protection from employment discrimination until 1964 with the passage of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, and education discrimination until 1972 with the passage of Title IX. American women could not own a credit card until the passage of the Equal Credit Opportunity Act of 1974. Prior to the mid-1970s, marital SA was legal in every state in the U.S. It took until 1993 for all marital SA laws to be removed from the books, with Oklahoma and North Carolina being the last two states to strike their exemptions. And still today, less than 4% of SA crimes against women in the United States result in a conviction. I wouldn't consider America to be a shining beacon on a hill when it comes to legal recourse against SA. But I also wouldn't argue that this justifies another country with more progressive values for women to occupy and rule over the United States either. It is true that many Arab countries restrict the mobility of women to leave the home unaccompanied by a man. However, this is not a rationale for those countries not having a right to exist. But when Shane brings up driving, this is an Islamophobic myth. Prior to June 2018, Saudi Arabia was the only country in the world where women were not allowed to obtain a driver's license. And now that is also a thing of the past. As for voting rights, this is another Islamophobic myth. Let's look at the countries that immediately surround Israel. In Syria and Lebanon, women gained universal suffrage in 1953. In Egypt, women gained universal suffrage in 1956, and in Jordan, it was 1974. In Iraq, women gained the right to vote in 1980. But when Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990, I don't recall anyone arguing that this represented the liberation of Kuwaiti women, who were not allowed to vote. They would not gain that right until 2004. And do you know who could vote in elections before women in Kuwait could? Women in Palestine. When the Palestinian Authority was formed in 1994, the right of women to vote was supported by 79% of Palestinians. Women voted in the following election of 1996, putting the moderate Fatah party into power with 89% of the vote. Several Arab states have made incredible strides forward for women's rights and advancement. In the UAE, over 70% of university graduates are women. Women make up 46% of the workforce and hold 50% of the seats in the Federal National Council. In Oman, women make up 50% of university enrollments and 46% of the workforce. These countries lead the way for women's rights in Middle Eastern nations and are looked to as examples to follow. There's no reason to think that women in a Palestinian state would get any worse treatment than their neighbors who have been making steady social progress for the last century, or that they would lack the voting rights enjoyed by fellow Arab women in neighboring countries. By comparison, let's look at how Arab women are treated under Israeli occupation. Israel has a long history of discrimination and violence against Palestinian women. This paper, published in 2023, found that a significant contributing factor to increased rates of IPV for Arab Palestinian women was their unequal treatment under the law in the state of Israel. 50% of femicides are committed against Arab women in Israel, despite only making up 20% of the population. This shocking report from the UN found that from 2000 to 2004, due to Israeli zoning restrictions preventing clinics from being built in Palestinian territory and border checkpoints controlling the movement of Palestinians in and out of their territory, 61 women were forced to give birth at checkpoints, with 36 infants dying due to delays reaching a medical facility. And since October 2023, according to a recent UN report, Israel has engaged in the systemic use of sexual, reproductive, and other forms of gender-based violence against Palestinian women. So let's not pretend that life is good for Palestinian women under Israeli occupation. It's not. It is a brutal and miserable existence. Clinging to this myth that if Palestinian people are given the right to self-determination, they will buck the trend throughout the Middle East and enforce uniquely draconian restrictions on women's rights is nothing more than Islamophobic propaganda used to justify Israel's project of colonizing the rest of the Palestinian territory and denying Palestinians basic human rights. This idea that your people don't get the right to self-determination because you won't do things the way we want you to, therefore we are going to occupy and rule over you, is 100% a Western colonial mindset. And trying to use some kind of women's rights argument as a shield to hide your colonialism is the worst form of dishonesty. But Shane's not done. He has more Islamophobic hate to spew as a justification for suppressing Palestinian freedom.
There are plenty of people in Palestine that would want a free democratic state, but unfortunately they are the minority. If Palestine gains statehood, it would be a radical Islamic Caliphate. That's what they would be. We know this because when they elect representatives to the Knesset, that is who they elect.
In the interest of not burying the lead, I want to make it abundantly clear that Hamas has only ever won one single election in Palestine, 20 years ago, and it was by a very narrow margin. But let's rewind a bit and deconstruct this entire argument. Your first clue that Shane has no clue what he's talking about is his deployment of the word caliphate, which I guess to him sounds big and scary. Historically, a caliphate is a multi-ethnic, transnational empire that is believed to be ruled over by the true heir to the Prophet Muhammad. A caliphate is then the embodiment of the idea of the one true Muslim empire. The two most contemporary uses of the term refer to the global caliphate that was attempted to be set up by Al-Qaeda and then ISIS, an idea that was widely rejected by mainstream Muslims. Hamas has absolutely no desire to set up a caliphate. Their political goals since their charter in 1988 have always been Palestinian sovereignty over the territory occupied by Israel. But this idea that Hamas would form the de facto government of a Palestinian state is also completely laughable and reveals Shane's deep ignorance of history. As I mentioned before, Hamas has been around since 1988, but chose to sit out the first parliamentary elections in 1996. It wasn't until they ran in 2006 as the Change and Reform Party that they narrowly beat Fatah for control of parliament, 44% to 41%. Hamas came into power due to two factors. First, dissatisfaction with the ruling Fatah party over widespread corruption and their willingness to capitulate to demands from Israel. And secondly, Hamas positioned themselves in that election as a moderate opposition party. Many believed they represented a nonviolent means of resistance moving forward that would simply have a backbone when negotiating with Israel. This parliamentary election is the only time in history that Hamas has won a national election among Palestinians. Because of the close split in the vote and the fact that Mahmoud Abbas, the leader of the Fatah party, won the presidential election in Palestine, a power-sharing unity government was formed. Meanwhile, Israel reacted to the election of Hamas members to parliament by raiding the territory and arresting dozens of MPs without justification, notably the most moderate members of the party. These raids and arrests by Israel had the consequence of leaving the most militant members of Hamas at large and in power, and they reacted to Israel's aggression by breaking their power-sharing deal with Fatah, murdering Fatah leaders, and seizing control of the Gaza Strip by force. They then proceeded to take steps to suspend any future elections going forward, and Palestinians have never had a chance to vote in another election since. The lack of elections since 2006 is in part due to Hamas interference, but also in part due to Israeli interference as well. When elections were supposed to occur in 2021, Mahmoud Abbas suspended them because Israel was disallowing Palestinians in East Jerusalem from voting, the very Palestinians Abbas was counting on to restore the Fatah party to power. And Benjamin Netanyahu has worked tirelessly over the last decade to keep Hamas in power against the will of the Palestinian people, so that he could use them as an excuse to conduct more bombings and seize more Palestinian territory. To summarize, it's important to understand that since Hamas won a single election in 2006, and by a very narrow margin, Israel has aided in purging the most moderate voices within Hamas, and Hamas has assassinated and expelled all of their political opposition, ruling through violence and intimidation, not by the will of the people. This idea that given the chance to hold free and fair elections, that the Palestinian people would elect the very people who have been brutalizing them and ruling by force for the past 20 years is nothing more than Israeli propaganda. This is a lie rooted in Islamophobia and ignorance used to deny the Palestinian people their right to self-determination. It's true that many political scientists fear that a Palestinian state may be unstable or rely heavily on outside aid in order to be economically viable. Questions remain about whether Palestinians would elect a reformer like former Prime Minister Salam Fayyad or a corrupt leader like Mahmoud Abbas. But these are questions that, like every other people on this earth, the Palestinian people have the right to answer for themselves. The future is far from certain. It always is. When Benjamin Franklin exited the Constitutional Convention on September 17, 1787, he was asked what form of government had been chosen, a republic or a monarchy. He answered, "A republic, if you can keep it." Over the next 250 years, Americans have chosen to keep that republic and expand rights and liberties to the people they once denied them to. It did not have to go the way it did. The outcome was always uncertain. Palestine's future is no more or less certain than America's was in 1787. The only thing that is certain is that as long as Palestinians are denied their own state and remained under occupation by Israel, they are being denied the most fundamental of human rights, the right to determine their future for themselves.